Hey everybody, coming to you today to talk to you about intervals. A lot of people use them, a lot of people misuse them, and there's not really great guides to tell you exactly how far to go or how long to go in different interval styles. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to go over some just simple rules and simple heuristics, a basic guideline and schema to go over how to create your own intervals. Okay, so what we have here for you is an example person. Okay, this person has these max times in the mile, 5K, 10K, and half marathon. You see, this is not necessarily an elite person. They have, I would say average running ability, but not terrible. I think a lot of people who are recreational runners or, dabble in running would fall somewhere along this line. Okay, so this is an everyday person, a good example, and should apply to a lot of people. So what do we do with these things? And the reason that we use this sort of framework is because if we just use, do this amount of time at your mile pace, okay, or your 5K pace. So for someone who's very fast, their 5K pace is 15 minutes. For another person, their 5K time is 35 minutes. And so the time to exhaustion for those distances are very different for different people. So if you were to do a 3 or 4 minute interval for that really fast person who runs a 15-minute 5K, that's a really intense run. For a 3-minute interval for someone who runs a 35-minute 5K, it's not that intense, and you can actually stretch that out a good bit. So the interval for a fast person for a 5K would be very short. An interval at a 5K pace for someone who's a bit slower would be very long, comparatively speaking. Okay, so that's why I typically don't just use distances. What I want us to focus on is the time here. Okay, it's all based off of time. And what I like to do is I want to kind of split into thirds or quarters, kind of what times we're targeting. And so what we want to target is a time that's under about 10 minutes. Okay, so for some, this may be 3/4 of a mile. Some, it could be close to their 2 mile. For this person, it's going to be the 1 mile. Okay, we want to target something between 20 and 30 minutes. We want to target something around 50 minutes to an hour. And then we want to target something around 2 hours or an hour and a half. Okay, so in this way, we may have people that have different max distances they can do in these times, but we're focusing on the time because time is what matters, because that is what is going to determine the length of interval, because the interval is all done in time. Okay, so hopefully you're sticking with me so far. Now we're going to go into how do I use this information to create an interval for myself. And this is how. So if I look at these times, what I'm first going to do, and this can be longer or shorter, but a good rule of thumb on an interval is to use about 25% of the time to exhaustion in a given time frame. So if I'm looking at my mile, it's under 10 minutes. So pacing for a mile, my interval would be 25% of this time here. Okay, so 25% of 7:30 is about 2 minutes. 25% of my 5K time, this in between 20 and 30 minutes, okay, is 6 minutes. It's about 25%. 25% of my 10K or 50-minute pace-ish is 12 minutes. And 25% of my half time is, let me just look at my notes real fast. Easy, 30 minutes. Okay, so this is how we create an interval. Like I said, your interval, your work portion, your work time of the interval can be longer or shorter. It can be even up to 50% or so, and as low as maybe 10%. So for your mile or this 7:30 time frame, it would be closer to about 45 seconds to a minute would be on the low end. 50%, you'd be looking at 3 minutes and 45 seconds on the very high end for an interval. That would be a very intense interval. We're using 45 seconds to a minute. For this would be very low intensity and a good way to introduce it. But like I said, the rule of thumb is 25% of the time to exhaustion of all of these is going to be our work time for our interval. Okay, so now what we have to think about and decide is how much total work are we going to be doing. Okay, and there's a couple of heuristics here for you, and it's, for the most part, intervals are going to fall between 50 to 75%, okay, of the work, of the total time. And so what this means is that 50 to 75% of this number right here. Just like we use that 25%. Okay, so what this means is for the sets and reps of my 1 mile, okay, it's going to equal about 50 to 75%. Okay, so I'll show you what that means. So 75% is typically what I'll use for shorter intervals and 50% for the longer intervals. Just looking for half as much of the time to exhaustion because they get pretty long if you go any further than that. So 75% here would be about 6 minutes. 75% here is about 18 minutes. 50% here is about 25 minutes. And 50% here is not quite, but it's close to an hour. Okay, so now we can see easily that, and this should actually, just make this 24 because that's going to be really easy to figure out. So now that I have this, now I figure out what are my sets and reps going to be. Pretty easy. If I just do this really quick math here, 3 by 2 minutes will give me 6 minutes. 3 by 6 minutes will give me 18. 2 by 12 minutes will give me 24. And 2 by 30 minutes will give me 60. So now we very quickly created our interval based on 25% of this time to exhaustion. And then we've used either 50 or 75, 75 here on these first two. Make a little note. And then 50% on these two. Okay. The last piece of the puzzle that we have to do is figure out how much rest we're going to take here. And what I tend to do is I tend to give more rest for the more intense intervals. So as I get closer to this sub 10-minute time frame, I'm going to take more rest. So what that means is that my work to rest ratio will be smaller. So my work to rest here, I might use something closer to 1 to 2. It's not written in stone, but I tend to use a little bit more than I would use on something like this, 2 sets of 30 minutes. Here, I might use a 3 to 1. So what this means is that for 2 times 30 minutes, I'm going to take 10 minutes rest in between those 30 minutes intervals. Okay? And then I'm just going to fill in, and I'll just give you kind of an ascending example of I'll use 1 to 1 here. It's probably more doable. And I'll use 2 to 1 here. So what would that look like? Then the rest would be 4 minutes here for the first interval because it's 1 to 2. The rest will be 1 to 1, so it'll be 6 minutes here. And then Here it'll be half as much, 2 work to 1 rest. So it'll also be 6 minutes rest here. And then like we said, 10 minutes there, 3 to 1. So you don't have to use these ratios, but understand that this is ordered this way because for the amount of time that you're working up here, it's more intense. So it's going to take longer for you to come back down to a place where you can repeat that effort and repeat that output. And so you can go 1 to 1 here, or you can go 2 to 1 here. You can do those things, and it would probably work out just fine. This is just a pretty simplified example of, you can see the flow of, generally you're going to need more rest here than you will here on this kind of much slower paced interval. Okay, so just to recap, for these, I'm using this pace, whatever this pace is, that I would do this mile in, because it's at 7:30, it's under 10, it's that kind of the first kind of window we're looking at. And then 5K, 10K, half. These are not set in stone, these distances. I'm looking at the times. But we use these to get a pace for these times and then apply that to the interval. So I would run at my half marathon pace for 2 sets of 30 minutes. I would run at my 10K pace for 2 sets of 12 minutes. I would run at my 5K for 3 sets of 6 minutes. And I would run my 1 mile pace for 3 by 2 minutes. And this is a simplified, easy way to structure your intervals and get a lot out of it. Now, the very last thing I'll say is that the only difference between the kind of 2 broad kind of categories of intervals are active and passive. An active interval means that you're going to do this 3 by 2 minutes. You're going to do the 2 minutes on, and then you're going to take 4 minutes and you're going to have a recovery jog or some sort of sub-max pace compared to your work pace. Okay, so that is an active interval. And what you'll tend to do is you'll see the output on the interval drop, or you're not emphasizing the recovery as much. You don't care much about repeating the output as high. You will sacrifice to have a slightly lower output, but have it more steady in nature. And so there's a lot of different things that go into that and reasons you would do that. But I like both of these types of intervals. I tend to stick to passive in shorter intervals, much shorter intervals, and I tend to stick to active in the longer intervals. And that kind of just on its face tells you that when I care more about going really fast and a high output, I'll use passive intervals where I have complete rest in between. And then on longer intervals, I'll use active rest or jog or recovery pace or whatever in between, because I don't care as much about going so fast because the pace isn't so great in magnitude. It's not a really intense pace. And so I can do this and then have a slower pace that I'll use in between. So that is as kind of simple and as clear cut and as kind of succinct guide on intervals that I'll go into. And this is actually, for the most part, how I program intervals. It's based off of time to exhaustion. It's not necessarily off of different distances, because like I said earlier, different people of different abilities will have different times for these distances. And time is what we really care about. So if you like the video, please like, subscribe, drop in the comments. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see education-wise, or anything you'd like to see in terms of methodology or prescription, anything like that in terms of exercise. Thanks for watching.